Back to install number 3, and today we're going to talk about practice and kind of the daily practice design and structure and what periods may look like. So as we talk about practice, obviously practice's purpose is to prepare us for the game and for our athletes to improve on the skills that we need them to exhibit during the game. And so practice is obviously a very vital time period, a very vital component of athlete development. And so, like I said, today we're going to talk about the individual periods of practice, and then we're also going to talk about the whole practice structure as a whole. If you look at the left-hand side there, you kind of see what a traditional practice plan might look like. Being a former college athlete and beyond, practice on a daily basis was typically the same thing day in and day out. Or the same periods in the same order, maybe a little bit of different allotted time to each period based on earlier versus later in the week. But typically, as a player, you kind of got into this routine of knowing what period was next, knowing what periods were important, other ones you kind of, were less important, etc. So you kind of got in this boring routine of knowing exactly what was coming up next. And that's not a great structure to challenge. It's not a great structure to have our athletes be continually learning and adapting. It may be a decent structure early on in the season for athletes to get accustomed to the structure of practice, some of the periods consist of. But as a whole, if we move to the two right-hand examples, more of a random-based practice, in all the literature and research showing comparing blocked versus random practice in basically any kind of sport you can think of, random practice, while it does show more struggle, a little bit less high performance during practice, what it actually shows is that performance actually shows up on game day. Because random practice, as you can see here, more closely mirrors and mimics the behaviors, the randomness, the complexity of sport within practice. So instead of doing the same exact period design and period layout day in and day out, all random asks you to do is to just switch up some of those things throughout every single practice. And so athletes do not get into this monotonous routine of knowing exactly what's next. Instead, now they're kind of kept on their toes. They may not know exactly when some of these more important periods are, or when they're going to be on the field, or when they're going to be off, kind of like they would in a game day, where there's going to be a little bit of this randomness, this complexity to sport. We can take some of those pieces and add it into our practice structure. And this is a really simple design. Instead of just, change up 3 different practice periods, just move them around a little bit. That's all it consists of. And we'll get into a little bit more here about how each one of these individual practice periods could also involve some more randomness versus just block training. And again, if you look at a traditional indie period for most programs, it involves probably the same 2 to 3 drills laid out in the same manner, in the same order throughout the whole year. So you're talking 12 to 20 weeks of athletes doing the same exact blocked random block practice during indie periods. And again, these athletes aren't being challenged, they aren't being pushed, they're not adapting to these stresses because it's not challenging them. And so we can apply many of these same principles to actually these individual periods as well. So what might a better practice look like and what some of the periods may consist of? I just laid out what a hypothetical practice plan for a certain day may look like. And we're going to go through each of these individually. And again, with any practice, like I said before, these periods would be switched around, mixed up on a daily basis to keep some of these different these athletes on their toes, if you would, to keep them engaged, to keep them prepared for some of the randomness, chaoticness of sport. So let's go from the top here. We'll start with a positional warm-up. So again, I feel that warm-up is probably the most wasted of time period in football. If you look at it from high school, college, and beyond, typically a warm-up is just 10 to 15 minutes of kind of BS. It's athletes sitting on the ground, maybe they're static stretching, maybe they're doing some choreographed skips, karaoke, shuffles, etc. But as a whole, it's a wasted period. So how can we make this better? Can we make this this warm-up period, this 10 to 15 minutes, actually more productive? And what I propose would be a positional specific warm-up. We know this is that athletes, especially the higher level they go, need to become more calibrated to this task-specific context that they're going to perform under. Hence why if you go play golf, what's your warm-up consist of? It's going to consist of a lot more time spent on the range with each club calibrating your body around those daily constraints than it is doing, karaoke, shuffles, and things like that. So the same thing can apply to football. Our offensive linemen should be doing something different than our wide receivers, and our D-backs should probably be doing some sort of different warm-up than our linebackers. And it's not a very hard adjustment to have some of these athletes or these positions just do small, subtle changes, working with a partner or even working with the opposite position group. So maybe receivers are working with D-backs, and we're just going side by side, and the receivers jogging downfield and then snapping down to a break point while the defense is on their hip, eyes on their hip, low eyes. When they see the hips drop, they stop. So both parties are getting position-specific, contextual, perceptual information. The receiver's working on breakpoint mechanics in a low-level, warm-up type environment, while the defensive back now is working on a ton of reps of perception, perceiving a receiver from a kind of a hip position. And we can do that from each hip. You can do it from front, do it from behind, etc. So there's a lot of different ways that we can add really high-quality repetitions. And what you find is that the engagement is a lot higher than it is during our traditional warm-up when they're doing the same exact warm-up day in and day out. So this is a great opportunity, I think, for coaches to, involve players, which we'll talk about here in the next slide, have them have some input. Great opportunity for them to say, this would be a great thing I think we could do during warm-up because it helps prepare me for what we do coming up during practice. And B, it might help involve coaches. Your position coaches, what are traditionally during warm-up, what are they doing? They're usually walking around bullshitting with players, kind of honestly being a disruption during this period. Now they can actually be involved. Now we can actually use this as a small indie period. Again, think about just 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes of more position-specific, context-specific warm-up. That could be as much as 5 hours. 5 hours or more throughout the course of a season. If you're just dedicated 5 minutes of this positional warm-up a day, we're talking about 5 hours of more repetitions, more engagement, more perceptual, work with an opponent. This would be a very valuable time. So I think warm-up could be a much better use, a more functional use for our teams rather than just our traditional trying to increase body temperature, trying to prepare the nervous system. We can do all those things, but actually include highly specific movement patterns, highly specific perceptual information for our athletes to attune to, which I think will help them. Like I said, 5 minutes a day equals 5 hours, a year. We're talking about additional 20 hours of work for our athletes over the course of their career, which could be a ton of work, a ton of benefit for them to actually make more plays in the field. And the last bullet there, like I said, involve players. Again, this is a quote that I can't remember who's attributed to, but tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. Can we find ways to involve our athletes? And I think a warm-up is a low cost but a high benefit way to involve our athletes. Involve them and they have much more engagement, much more autonomy, and they will, I think, derive a lot more benefit. So homework number 1, write down how you'd program a warm-up for a football team. As a whole group, how could you do it as a whole group? With all the positions, 80 to 100 players. How would you design a warm-up or program a warm-up for a specific position group? And then how can we get other coaches involved? So like I said, during this warm-up time, they're not just walking in and out of the lines, talking with players, being a little bit of a distraction, etc. How can we get them involved or have them not be a distraction in this period? Number 2, we're going to talk about speed development and contact or collision development. So why emphasis on speed? I think we emphasize it during the off season in most strength and conditioning programs. But why can't we maintain this during the in season or during actual practices? A simple 5-minute period of reiterating some of these basic positions, mechanics, techniques of acceleration and top end, max velocity, I think could go a long ways. We know that better mechanics equals increased performance, so they're going to run faster, and also increased efficiency, meaning that they can now play at speeds, whatever speed you're talking about, lower level speeds or high level speeds, at a much lower cost expenditure. So it's going to be much more efficient. So they're not going to be expending as much energy to running because they have cleaner, simpler, more efficient mechanics. And this leads to a reduction of injury. It can lead to more fatigue resistance because they're being more efficient with their mechanics. We'll see maybe less soft tissue injuries because our athletes are in better shapes and positions. They're not casting out, they're not overstriding, they're not heel striking during max speed where they're putting maybe their hamstrings or other muscular tissue at risk because of poor mechanics. Why also emphasize speed? Because literature is starting to suggest and show, and I think college football coaches that have access to GPS and things like that will probably reiterate that in a typical practice, if we're talking about the speeds that our athletes are reaching, they're probably not reaching max velocity speeds on an average practice. So this research was actually done in soccer and European football, but what they showed in small-sided games, so things like maybe Skelly, like inside, maybe one-on-ones, like group work, athletes are only reaching in soccer, only reached about 82% of their max speed. So if we had a flying 10 and a 40-yard dash, that's our athletes' peak velocity. During small-sided games or small group activities, they're only at about 82% of that max speed. Now during the actual game, so maybe in football this might be 11 on 11, might be some special teams, etc. Athletes are only reaching 92% of max speed. So again, they're not actually touching or tapping into the max velocity. And we know those are some very good benefits to the nervous system. We know that's very good benefits to the tissue, resiliency and robustness that, maybe some of these hamstring issues that athletes are coming down with might be attributed to the fact that they aren't running at max speed. So can we do this during practice? Because we may know that it's not actually happening during some of these practice periods. Again, those that with access to GPS can probably better answer this than I'm relying on this research from soccer, but I'm sure it's pretty similar on a daily basis. So maybe there's an opportunity to take off the pads, take off the helmet and shoulder pads, so we're reducing some weight, and really let our athletes, work on the mechanics and techniques, but also be exposed to some of these high velocities early in practice with a high recovery, anywhere from just 1 to 3 reps before going into our normal practice. There may be some benefit to doing this, maybe even just 1 day a week might be beneficial. Number 2, contact and collision or impact development. We talked about last week about the impact-induced muscle damage and how that is a different stress than, say, sprinting, than lifting. It induces a different stress on the body than those other things. And that's one of the things that early on in camp, when we're starting to get more contact, where we see a lot of the soreness, where we see some of the soft tissue issues, is that athletes aren't prepared for this. And we know tackling in football is a huge, huge problem. How do we tackle? How do we become better tacklers in a game when we can't really do it in practice? When there's conference rules across the country that doesn't allow any kind of contact or tackling during the week of practice. How do we become better tacklers? And I don't have an answer for this, but maybe some small periods, and I think defense players obviously do this already, 5-minute periods throughout the week of working on collision and impact development might be beneficial. So what does this mean and what does it look like? Let's take a look here. So the first video I'm going to show you here is just what a typical football kind of practice might look like. And this might actually be decent for preparing the body and tissues for contact. What I would argue is this, is that those videos you just watched with the opponent not really fighting back, with them not really moving, things like this. At contact, the offensive runner just dies or tackling the bag. Are those things actually preparing our athletes to tackle a live running back or wide receiver? So again, those more technical things that we saw earlier in the videos, and even midway through the videos, are those really actually building the base that allows us to be better tacklers, more adaptable tacklers to actual opponents, to actual running backs, receivers, tight ends, etc., that actually are going to move and try to deceive us, or they're trying to run us over, or are going to fight back when we make contact? Again, those things might be okay to prepare the body early on in camp to progress some of the stresses from lower level to higher level. That might be okay. But are they actually building the skills? Are they actually behaving? Does that actually look and feel and act like what a tackle looks like in a game? It's a question that coaches have to ask themselves. Personally, I would say no. And then we see things like going on today. More tackling videos here, I'll show you. With bags that have things you can grab, bags that roll and move. With things that now the coach is pulling the bag. Now this might, take some of those drills that we saw in the first video, that I would personally classify as like a 1 or a 2 representativeness. So on the representative scale, that is pretty low. I mean, I think these might be a little bit higher, so maybe a 3 or 4. But overall, I don't know if these things are really actually pushing the needle forward into developing better tacklers. Personally, again, they may be beneficial to start to build some of that contact and collision resiliency and tissue robustness, but as a whole, I don't know if they're proven tackling. Now, this is something where if the strength and conditioning coaches on here, that we could be doing in the off season is preparing our athletes for this. Something that we do almost 2 to 3 days a week is some sort of contact and collision period where we're working on athletes going against each other. So the offensive person is actually trying to get away. We have 2-on-1, we have 1v2. We might go right here, hip hitting. So we're working on center of gravity, low base position, just getting some of those small collisions and impacts that help prepare those tissues. So when fall camp and the season comes around, they're a little bit more prepared. The tissues are more robust for that. But again, all these things I think can be done in pads and they're safe, low risk activity that I think would make our athletes better, actually better tacklers. It actually behaves and looks a little bit more like sport. It's still definitely not a 10 on a representative scale, maybe a 5 or 6, but I think it's definitely a step up from some of these bag drills that you see are very popular. So homework number 2, how could you convince a football coach to actually add maybe 5 to 10 minutes of dedicated speed development or contact development to practice? What would this period look like for you? B, or last one, C, is this period actually worthwhile? Are these qualities already being developed in practice? Again, this is something to ask yourselves. Coaches that might have more access to information than me may say, well, we don't need these periods because maybe our athletes, maybe our skill players are reaching max velocities during practice as they did during the offseason. Maybe our defensive back, ran a fly 10 in 0.95, so they had whatever that is, 22 miles per hour. Maybe they're hitting 22 miles per hour during practice. So maybe they are being exposed to those things. I can't answer that for every one of your athletes or position groups, etc. Maybe the defensive players are going through, tackle prep periods that are kind of representative and preparing these tissues early on in camp or even the off season. So maybe these periods aren't actually worthwhile for your program, your team. You have to ask yourself that question. So homework number 2. As we move on, we're going to talk about team situational with special teams. So everyone does team situational, and by this, when teams typically think about team situational, they're thinking about maybe third down, they're thinking about red zone, maybe they're thinking about first and 10, etc. Those are kind of their situationals: third and short, third and long, first and 10, red zone, goal line, etc. Things like that. So when I'm talking about situational, I'm talking about maybe every day. What I would do as a head coach, if I was a head coach, was I wouldn't tell any of the players nor my coordinators what was going to happen for that day, but I'd come in a situation and present it to the team, and we play on like a scrimmage from there, going essentially live or thud or two-hand touch, whatever you want to do from that. So like this. And what these situations should do is they should challenge. This period is just as much to challenge the coaches as it is to challenge the players. Again, a frustration I have when working with football coaches is why do we have to script every single play, every minute, every second of practice? In a game, you don't do that. In a game, you don't schedule and structure every single play call. You have to call your plays on the fly. You have to adapt. You have to see the situation. You have to see the context. You have to go by what's working, what's not working. You have to make adjustments, etc. Why don't we practice that during practice? But every team play is scripted. Every skelly inside, every play that we run during the practice is scripted in a typical practice. Less play sheets, less scripted plays, more calling like you would in the game. So, for example, like this: if we're a team that maybe emphasizes the middle eight, and this is something we'll talk about in later episodes about using analytics and whatnot. But a lot of teams are starting to stress the middle eight, meaning if they can, wherever possible, they want to defer to the second half to receive the ball. And then what they want to hopefully do is, end the half with the ball. So ideally, if those last 4 minutes of the first half, hopefully they can get the ball. They can kind of, ideally would score, but also B, run off as much time off the clock as possible so the opposing team doesn't have the ball. And then in the second half, you get to start with the ball again. So you kind of steal a possession there, and then the opposing team's offense, in real time, they're off the field for like an hour. You're talking about, that 4 minutes. You're talking about the 4 minutes of the last 4 minutes of the first half, a 20-minute halftime, plus you getting the ball at halftime. They may not actually be on the field for an hour of game time. So now they're losing rhythm. The quarterback may be getting cold and stiff. The offensive coordinator for that opposing team has lost kind of their rhythm and how they're going to play, call plays, etc. So that might be something that teams emphasize. So it's one thing to emphasize it on a PowerPoint or whiteboard. Hey, we're going to really emphasize the middle eight, and to actually live it out. So as a head coach, what might I do? All right, I might also get to this period and say, here's the situation. We're getting the ball from a punt. 3 minutes and 45 seconds left in the clock. We're up by 3 points. 3:45 till halftime. Go. So what we do, you play with special teams. We start with the punt. So the punt goes off to our team, to our one offense who catches it and receives it, and then they're going to go against the one defense, and we're going to play out that situation. If the offense has to punt, we're going to run a punt down. We're going to play out till halftime. Okay, and there's basically I go one offense versus one defense. If they punt and have to turn the ball over, we'll go 2 offense versus 2 defense. And then we have special teams going. So now we're actually running players on and off the sideline like we would in the game. Coaches are on the sideline. Coaches are in the box. There's a game clock, play clock, scoreboard. There's context. You're going to get 1st and 10. You're going to get 3rd and long, 3rd and short. You're going to get 2nd and medium. You can get all those situations that you kind of practice. Now you're actually going to get it in a contextual live environment. And coaches are really now being challenged to actually apply some of these things that they need to apply during game day. And so for me, maybe a 10, 15-minute period like this once or twice a practice, I think would be far more beneficial than just scripting out 12 third and long plays. And then next periods, it's 12 third and short plays. I think this would actually be more beneficial for the coaches because, again, coaches, we ask our athletes to be adaptable. We ask our athletes to put themselves in pressure situations. But coaches, we don't really do that as much. We don't really challenge ourselves in that way. Now this is a chance now for coaches to go in unprepared, and they have to call the game or call this period by feel, by adjusting, by seeing the defense, rather than knowing what they're going to call. So they're comfortable the whole time. I think this would be a really, really good period. Next one would be Team Scout. And Team Scout is kind of near and dear to my heart because when I coached college football, I ran the defensive scout team. I was kind of the lowest rung offensive of coach, and so I ran the defensive scout team. And it was something that I actually enjoyed. I tried to make it as engaging and fun for those athletes as possible. We'd have our own little film sessions. I'd buy them pizza. I'd try to get them to play hard. Would celebrate things like that. But scout team is in one of those periods that can oftentimes be very, very mundane, boring for the scout defense. It can be a lack of a period. I can tell you this as a player, I hated scout team. Why? Because the defense usually never behaved or played very hard. They never played like the opposing defense played. And just I could tell those guys weren't engaged or didn't want to be there as well. If the scout defense did well, usually they'd get yelled at for cheating a play or for not lining up correctly or whatever it may be. Hey, don't play like this. I even have NFL guys that are on the practice squad, and so they run the scout team for NFL, and they'll have coaches. My players will have coaches tell them, hey, bite on this play. So they're not even playing like they would in a game. So it's not really giving the actual main team, the offense or defense, a good look. They're just going through the motions, and it's not beneficial. Instead, use your coaches. Why wouldn't, if I'm doing scout defense, why would I have an offensive coach run the scout defense? Why wouldn't I have maybe a GA or the lowest rung defensive coach the scout team? And now run the defense, run that scout team like they would their own defense. Use your own language, your own lingo. I know every team's defense is a little bit different, but in today's world, most defenses are more similar than they are dissimilar. So why not just have scout team meetings, make small adjustments, but we're still going to use our language. We're going to use our terminology. We're going to use our hand signs. I want you guys to play fast. And as offensive coaches, we can't be pissed off if a guy lines up at 5 yards instead of 8 yards. We can't be pissed off if a guy lines up in a 2-eye rather than a 3 technique. Because guess what? Players on the opposing team, they make mistakes too. Sometimes they line up in a 2-eye rather than the 3. Sometimes they line up in a 5 rather than a 6. Those things happen. So play it out. Don't get so pissed off. That's part of the game. But I think you'd get more development from your scout team. And again, these are scout team guys that hopefully in 2 to 3 years are playing on your varsity offense or defense. So shouldn't we be valuing their time and not having them read off of cards and just go through the motions and play off a card? Don't we want them to actually play real football? Again, a team that I played for and coached, There's a guy in the scout team as a freshman that was not last year on the NFL active roster. Those things happen. The guys as freshmen are on scout team that will play varsity minutes and start and maybe go and play beyond that. So those things have to be involved and included. Next, we got Indy. So Indy, again, after warm-up might be the next most wasted period in football. How many fundamentals do we practice in Indy that actually don't happen in the game? A lot of them. If you look at most Indies, they're just drills rehashed, the same 3 to 4 drills rehashed year in and year out with no actual reasoning behind why we actually use them. And instead, Indy time should encourage exploration and create opportunities to interact with information. It should build technique within that whole sporting environment. Think about building skills, not drills. So again, here's a typical Indy session for a quarterback. I've never seen a quarterback move or behave like that. I don't know what he's working on. Here's how a quarterback actually behaves in the game. Again, we have to question, why are we doing those things? How is this developing a quarterback? Their footwork, their balance, their ability to move in a pocket when there's no information present. Here's for some defensive players. Linebacker. Compared to this linebacker behaving in the game. Here's trying to get off a block, extending. And obviously the basis behind this sometimes makes sense, but now this is how it looks in a game. Did those two things look similar? Did they actually behave and act similar? The classic bag drills. I've never seen a linebacker, or any player for that matter, move like this in the game. If they did, we'd probably yell at them. So again, we have to evaluate those things. Are they just, for the most part, they're probably just a waste of time. They're adding more volume. They're adding more pounding to our athletes. Evaluate these things. Another chance for Indy might be to do something a little more radical, but do the opposite position groups Indy. So receivers do the defensive Indy group. As someone that played both ways, I can tell you that playing defense helped me tremendously as a receiver because I got more insight, more information about what the defensive back is looking for, how they're using leverage to their advantage, and why they're using leverage, why they might press versus why they might be bailing off, where the quarterback plays into this, where timing plays into this, and so knowing some of the basic skills and knowing kind of what the defense is looking for helped me as an offensive player, and I think vice versa as well. So maybe just one day a week, just 5 minutes, having receivers or offense linemen or defense linemen do the opposite position groups Indy to know what the kind of technique they're doing, to why they're doing those things, what they're looking for, where they're trying to guide or lead an athlete to, could tremendously help athletes. And I know no one's probably doing that, and probably a lot of people think that's a dumb idea, but something I do with my athletes all the time. We switch roles all the time because now a receiver playing defensive back is understanding and learning that the defensive back is trying to do this to me. Now I can take that information back when I'm on offense and use that against them. Also during Indy, it's a chance, I think, for worst case scenarios. So punters, holders, kickers, they maybe can do quarterback Indy. If we're going to run a fake punt or there's a bad snap, and we've seen it all the time, we've seen it on not top 10, those players are totally not prepared to throw the ball, totally not prepared to do things like that. Maybe doing quarterback Indy once a week where they can learn to throw the ball, or they're actually throwing to moving targets and things like that, may actually save ourselves from those worst case scenarios. Or maybe then those kickers and punters, holders doing linebacker Indy once a week where they're getting or going through a tackling circuit because, again, punters, kickers, holders, we're talking about one of the biggest plays in the game, a potential punt return or kick return for a touchdown, and we've all seen it. The kicker in space looks like a fish out of water, doesn't want to make a tackle, and they kind of basically give them a touchdown. I think every coach would agree that if they could make half those tackles, we'd be very happy. We could save half some of those touchdowns, or even all those touchdowns during the season where you're talking about maybe 1 or 2 opportunities, and we save those opportunities. I think every coach would agree that's a great value, a great return on our investment. If we can just have our punters and kickers do Indy, tackling circuits once or twice a week, and that might save a touchdown, that's well worth our investment. Next is one-on-ones. So while one-on-ones are great, they do lack in a lot of areas, such as I think what happens when we run one-on-one routes or one-on-one pass rush is that Players typically lose insight or brain space of what space is. Space from the teammates, space from opponents, and space from the field. They lose insight on how their route or how their pass rush fits into the full scheme of your team. And that's really what's most important, knowing how you fit in the scheme. What is your role? What is this route's role in the whole scheme? Quarterbacks, when they're throwing, and during one-on-ones have no pressure. There's no help defender, so low or high. They don't have like a apex player underneath that they have to throw around. They don't have a high safety that they throw underneath. So there's no context in what this throw may look like. So now they may actually be developing bad habits and putting the ball too high where a high safety might get there, or they might be throwing the ball too low underneath where an apex player would be able to tip that or even intercept it. So maybe include those players within your one-on-one sessions to have better context for both the receiver and the quarterback. Defensive linemen during one-on-ones pass rush have no threat of a help defender. They have no threat of a chip or a double team, or if a guard doesn't have anyone to block, he'll come out and help that tackle. They don't have that threat in one-on-ones. Again, usually lacks context. There's no down and distance. There's no threat of a run or pass. It's not realistic for the most part. So what can we do here? Again, in one-on-ones passing, D-backs versus receivers, include a pass rusher, include an underneath or safety or an outside backer, whatever it may be. Include those things in your activities. In one-on-one pass rush, maybe have the guard help off if the defensive end takes too long. Maybe have a running back there to chip. So those type of things. What we need to do with one-on-ones is think about it is we're using one-on-ones to increase the toolbox, to try new things, to also work on varying up our movements. So I'm trying to make multiple things look the same or make the same thing look different. And what I'll show you guys here in a second. And then also this is a great opportunity to film or record from multiple angles. Film from behind the receiver, behind the defensive back during one-on-ones, not just the wide view. This is a much better angle for these athletes to learn from. So when we use one-on-ones, what do we typically use it as? So this athlete here, he's got to run the same route, so a corner, but make it look different. So now we're expanding his toolbox. And we might do that 3 times. Here's a receiver. We're going to say we're going to run the same stem, but 4 different routes. Everything's the same stem, but every route is different. So now our athletes are actually getting creative. They're working to expand their toolbox. It's not just going through the motions. Each stem's got to look the same, and they're trying to build a repertoire off each other. They're trying to expand how this stem can build into 4 different routes, or how it can make this one route. Again, if you're a receiver or a pass rusher, you might, at the end of the day, come down and run the same route or do the same pass rush 5 times. Well, I got to make each one of those 5 times look different so the offensive lineman or D-back doesn't pick up on what I'm doing. And because it was successful early in the game does not mean it'll be successful later in the game. So I got to be adaptable and creative in that moment. Because if I just run the same, say a hook route, and I get a first down in the first quarter, well, guess what? The guy we're playing against is as a human being. They're going to adjust and adapt. And if your route looks exact same, they're going to pick up on those things. They're going to pick up on those cues. And now they're going to jump that route. In the fourth quarter, when we might need it the most, that route is no longer open because you're not adaptable in making that same route look different. Same with the pass rush. If I was a coach, maybe I'd say, hey, today we're going to do everything off a forklift move, okay? So you're going to maybe do a forklift. Then we can do a forklift, chop and rip underneath. We're going to do a forklift to a spin. So everything's built off the same kind of first step, the first 2 steps into a forklift, and now we're going to be adaptable off of that forklift. The video just showed here for receivers, this is what we do during one-on-ones all the time is, hey, you got to run 3 corner routes in a row, and they all got to be different, okay? So those are the things that we'll have for our players in that regard. Group work. So this is like, quarterbacks and receivers together throwing routes on air. Maybe the defense, the linebackers and the D-backs working on pass drops, again, typically on air. Maybe it's the linebackers and D-linemen working on run fits, again, typically on garbage cans and things like that. So for this, try to reduce unopposed practice. Again, unopposed practice is, again, throwing the ball in air. Quarterbacks throwing the receivers on air. So the receivers nor the quarterback have any rush. They don't have an opponent out there. They're throwing to just random space. There's no context involved. Reduce the amount of repetitive pre-planned plays. It's not all that beneficial, and it's more stress. It's more actually, unnecessary volume and pounding than it is benefit. Instead, use constraints to encourage various skills. So change the space, change the number of opponents, use different implements, manipulate times, all those type of things. It's easy as just throwing a person out there. At the receiver coach or just stand at 10 yards when they're running routes, that changes the information for the receiver. It changes the information for the quarterback. Easy ways to do that. Use bodies instead of garbage bins. One thing that's great about football is that you have a ton of bodies. So if you're doing, defensive linemen and running linebackers working on run fits, but you have garbage bins out there, or you have like the layout thing that's on the ground that has center guard tackle, just use human bodies. So now there's actually more perceptual information that is relevant to the game than garbage bins that aren't moving, that aren't behaving like athletes. Put athletes in disadvantaged or advantaged positions. So again, you can think about group practice. Might actually include some variations of one-on-one. It might include some variations of going against each other. Put athletes in advantaged or disadvantaged positions. When you do group work, really reiterate objectives, spacing, communication, yards after catch. So if you're doing routes, combination routes on air or on coaches, communicate or reiterate the objective of this is to work on spacing and communicate with each other. If defensively, if we're going to do, we're going to throw out receivers in 2 receiver sets or 3 receiver sets, and those kind of sets, and whether it's to the boundary or to the field, will dictate the coverage that we're running. Emphasize this period of group work is to emphasize communication. As a coach, I'm going to take a step back, and you guys have to communicate with each other of how we're going to figure this out. And again, like you talked about last week, yards after catch or explosive plays, always reiterating that. Group work might be a time where you have a non-verbal period. If you're going into a loud environment where some of these hand signs or some of the verbal signs, verbal communication won't be relevant because it's going to be too loud, have a period during practice where you work on nonverbal communication. So whether it be, maybe it is hand signs, maybe it's just athletes being able to look at each other and knowing exactly what to do. Maybe it's a tap on the hip, whatever it may be, a nonverbal period where, hey, for this period, we're going to run these combination routes, or we're going to defend these combination routes as a defense, but no communication. You guys all have to do it non-verbally. So now they're getting used to being able to do that because they can't hear or they can't verbally communicate during game day. Skelly or inside. So we know Skelly's 7-on-7. Inside is kind of inside run. The first question I'll see at the bottom here is this period actually useful for your offense? If you're a team that uses heavy RPOs or play action passes, or a lot of draws and screens, is this period actually all that useful for you? Because these typical periods maybe aren't the best for you if those are kind of the mainstays in your offense, because you're not going to be able to get the essence of those things in these periods. Or if that is your offense, why not include those things within these periods? So if we're doing Skelly, why can't we run screens? Why can't you run a quarterback draw or even a running back draw? Why can't you do run plays? So now all of a sudden you get, Skelly's notorious for the defensive players getting unrealistic drops, and all of a sudden linebackers 15 yards deep into the hook zone, and it's just like that, you'll never get there in a game. And so throw in a run play. So now we're keeping the defensive honest. I think a defensive coach would be very, receptive to, hey, we're going to run some draw plays or quarterback draws or screen plays in this. We might even run some RPOs during this period, and there might be handoffs, and that's okay. I think during Skelly we should have a rusher. So now the quarterback's got to feel where the rusher's coming from. That will alter his pocket mechanics. That'll alter his arm mechanics, his arm slot, and when the ball's got to be out. Always have a down and distance, and I think at the higher levels this is becoming more and more consistent to have two guys that are always on the chains. So you always have a down and distance. So you always have some context there. Maybe use these periods for advantage versus disadvantage. So maybe if I'm doing Skelly, which typically involves 7-on-7 is what it's typically called, but it's really only 5 eligible receivers going out. Maybe I'm going to have my 5 eligible receivers against a drop 8, so 8 guys in coverage. Maybe it's just a drop 6. Maybe I'm just going to send 3-man routes. So just, maybe an X, a Z, and an M or a slot receiver versus 7 versus 5. So can we have this as an advantage or disadvantage period? Can we use this for kind of an energy system development for our defense? So if our defense is going against a no-huddle up-tempo offense, maybe I have 2 groups of offense going out now, okay? And we're just going one after each other. So it's offense 1 goes out, quickly runs a play, and offense 2 comes up, quickly runs a play. So now their defense is getting a feel for this up-tempo. You can do this if your offense doesn't run an up-tempo, or it's just ways to really actually challenge them and maybe probably even go faster than they'll experience during the game. So get them uncomfortable. That way during Saturdays or Sundays when they actually experience this, they're used to that speed and that tempo. During the inside, same thing. Maybe run a pass play, run a play action pass, and you got your tight ends involved in the inside. Have them go out for a pass. Have your running back go out for a pass. Sorry about this. This happens all the time here. Have it down in distance. Same thing. Maybe go against a 8 or 9 man box. Maybe go against a 5-6 man box. So there's advantage or disadvantage to those things there. So there's ways to make scaling inside more productive, or again just to make that practice a little bit more random rather than it's the same period every single day. A rest. I would definitely have a rest period. So I'd have a period at least once a week, if not more, where we're having like a 10-minute halftime. So now we can use it like a halftime. So coaches now get to meet with each other. So the offensive staff and defensive staff meet to assess certain aspects of practice this far. They can make adjustments, etc., things like that. Players now get a chance to sit down. They get a chance to communicate, maybe certain plays. They get to communicate with each other like they would during halftime. You get to try out nutritional interventions. So now maybe we have fruits on the sidelines or Gatorade, or maybe whatever your nutritional interventions are during halftime, we have them during the week now. So athletes are accustomed and used to those things. It's a chance for a medical staff and our athletic training staff to deal with certain injuries, to make practice adjustments, to communicate with coaches just as they would during halftime. And finally, how do players and coaches respond to this 5 to 10 minutes of rest? Halftime can be something that's difficult to deal with. You're talking about 15 to 20 minutes off your feet, sitting down, and you got to go back out and play. Again, later on here, we're going to talk about some of the actual research with halftime, how the first 10 to 20 minutes after halftime is one of the highest times for injury because athletes are typically get cold and they don't re-warm up. Athletes have low performance during that time because same thing, they're away from the sporting context. They're away from, they don't recalibrate at halftime to the constraints, etc. So let's see how our athletes respond to this, and now it's a time to actually use some of these interventions from nutritional to also re-warm up and things like that. So think about it. Maybe a 10-minute period of rest or halftime would be beneficial. Lastly, here are some better other ideas. Obviously, practice at the time of the game. If you have a night game, can you practice more at night? If you have an early game, can you practice early in the day? And that's tough, obviously, with high school football where you're kind of restricted to practicing after school. College football sometimes too with classes, but I think the more closely you can practice to the time of the game, the better for athletes to prepare for it. I can tell you this: it would be hard. It's hard when you practice, maybe at night, and then all of a sudden you have a game at noon on Saturday or Sunday, and you're used to practicing at 4:30 in the afternoon. That's a bit of an adjustment for an athlete and a player. We've talked about this: practice in similar conditions, surface conditions, noise, weather. Like I said, surfaces, grass versus turf. Again, this means practicing in similar conditions such as communications. How does a play get relayed into the field, into the game? Is it from hand signs? Well, let's do that during practice. Let's not have the coaches stand behind the play and then call in the play to the quarterback when that's not what's going to happen during the game. What can you cut and get the same results? What can you reduce from practice and get the same results? Again, don't mistake activity with achievement. Again, typically coaches, football especially, the longer we're out there, the better we're getting. That's kind of the assumption that, we can be out there for 3 hours, that's better than 2.5 hours. And 2.5 hours is better than 2 hours. Well, we know that's not typically true, right? So don't mistake activity with achievement. For every substance, low doses stimulate, moderate doses inhibit, and large doses kill, right? So sometimes more practice, longer practice, higher intensity practice is actually going to be a detriment to our performance rather than being an enhancer of performance. Finally, if practice isn't challenging, it's likely not going to be beneficial. Practice has to be challenging. It has to be hard. There's got to be components and periods where our athletes are being pushed to their challenge point. If not, it's likely not beneficial. And practice as a whole, during the season especially, is not challenging. It's monotonous. It's redundant. It's boring. Athletes aren't fun. They're not engaged. They're not being challenged. Those things have to be present in order for it to be beneficial. And I know there's weekly tactics and there's schemes we got to prepare for, and those things have to be watered down and start slow during the week. But there's got to be opportunities for athletes to be pushed and challenged. And also, they're kids. They're even professional athletes, and college athletes. At the heart of them, they're a human being. They want to have fun. They want to be engaged. Those things have to be present in order for our practices to be really beneficial. And a great quote to think about what practice actually is, right? So you can replace the gardener with coach and some of those vegetables with players, right? So the coach does not actually grow his or her players, right? We can only foster an environment in which those players do so. So it's about creating an environment, right? Creating an environment that allows our athletes to grow, allows our athletes to develop, allows our athletes to be pushed and challenged, because that's where growing occurs. Just like a gardener, they're not actually growing the actual plants and vegetables. They're just they're cultivating an environment. They're cultivating an ideal environment that lets those things happen. So that's what we think about as coaches. We're the gardener. We're not necessarily the dictator. So lastly, last homework, review your practices, whether it be if you're an actual football coach or you're a strength and conditioning coach. Review your practice. And by practice, I mean everything, your training days. Is it the same structure every single day, day in and day out? Are your players engaged and involved? Is practice leading to actual game day performance? I know that's impossible to measure, but is it? Do you think what you're doing in practice is helping on game day? If not, then why are we doing it? So what can you cut? What could you subtly change? All these things could be, need to be questioned. Lastly, write out 2 or 3 practice days, okay? As I showed in the beginning there, maybe, those kind of random practices, write up 2 or 3 practice days and what they might look like. Maybe write out a day for a Monday practice, a Tuesday practice, and a Wednesday practice, or whatever days of the week that you practice. What might each day look like? And next week, we're going to go into more of a weekly practice plan. This was more of obviously individual day. Next week, we'll talk about a weekly practice plan about what some of those things may or could look like. That will conclude here install number 3. Thanks, guys.